Today our topic is in continuation of corporate social responsibility. We will overlook the barriers of implementation. In today's topic barriers to successful implementation of CSR in supply chain, we will cover the followings. Number 1. Barriers to implementation and sources of conflict. Number 2. Overcoming barriers and resolving conflicts. Number 3. Turning strategy into action. Number 4. Measurement and communication. Number 5. Getting started. And number 6. Hints and tips. Our first topic is barriers to implementation and sources of conflict. Let's start with introduction. This section outlines some of the obvious barriers to successful implementation of a more responsible approach to business and their potential root causes. This will help you to identify key actions you can take to overcome these barriers. Like any change, implementation of responsible business practices is dependent on the presence of several key enablers. The absence of one or more of these leads to some common and easily identifiable problems. We will use the simple model to examine these in detail. Which were presented by ProQuest Consulting Limited, 2021. This model has 4 different sections, which are: Number 1, inertia. Number 2, confusion. Number 3, frustration. And number 4, false start. Now we will start understanding each section in brief. Let's start with first one, with C is inertia. Inertia results from a lack of pressure or willingness to change. Perhaps this is because there is no pressure from the outside world, or because such pressure is not recognized or is resisted. The pressure for change within an organization typically comes from the top down, in other words, from leaders who are convinced of the need for change. Ideally, change is made proactively, in advance of the need to do it, but often it is made after a weakness has been exposed. Enabler 1. Creating awareness and understanding. Possible implementation barriers. The organization is disconnected from changes in the market, i.e. changes are occurring but these demands are not being recognized fully or connected with becoming a responsible business. There is a pull/push from some stakeholders, but not all. There is no connection between existing initiatives, e.g. waste minimization, energy use reduction, control of hazardous substances, and corporate responsibility. The organization believes that corporate responsibility is a management fad that will pass. The organization considers that it is already advanced in terms of corporate responsibility and that no further action is required. Enabler 2. Building a coordinated response to social, economic, and environmental challenges. Possible implementation barriers. The organization has other priorities. There is an assumption that corporate responsibility initiatives will be addressed functionally as they arise. There may not be a clear view of the benefits or doubt that they can be realized. The organization may be unaware of the cost or risk of doing nothing. Now we will understand the confusion. Confusion results from a lack of shared vision and accountability. This most commonly occurs if corporate responsibility develops without the benefit of a coherent framework or without cross-functional input. It will also happen if the motivation for developing better practices is unclear or not deeply grounded in the culture of the organization. Enabler 2.1. Developing cross-functional understanding. Possible implementation barriers. There are gaps in an organization's body of knowledge or information. There are gaps in strategy, policies, or standards, or insufficient cross-functional input. There are gaps in management structures or accountabilities are fragmented. Standards conflict or are too open to interpretation. There is a lack of consensus about corporate responsibility or what needs to be done. Enabler 2.2. Defining the role of procurement. Possible implementation barriers. The procurement function does not have influence or responsibility for all procurement. The social, economic, or environmental impact of related functions is not considered, e.g. the impact of planning, finance, HR, and legal on suppliers and the supply chain, or the impact of marketing, sales, new product development, or R&D on the specification of the product or service and its design. Procurement lacks influence or credibility in respect of corporate responsibility. Enabler 2.3, creating policies, standards, and shared understanding. Possible implementation barriers. Standards are not aligned or conflict with others, internal/external/peer group or industry. Common standards do not exist or are emerging. Ownership and accountability for the standards are not clear. Standards have been developed by others, have been imposed, and are not realistic or practical or lack clarity. Enabler 2.4, building confidence, trust, and commitment. Possible implementation barriers. The buy-in and support of suppliers or operational managers is low or absent. There is a lack of trust/confidence in those championing corporate responsibility. There are conflicting messages, priorities, or demands. The suppliers lack the incentive to change or adopt new standards. Costs and benefits are not distributed equitably between supplier and buyer. The buyer lacks the incentive to change/adopt new standards. Corporate responsibility generates additional work or compliance burden with little value add to those involved. Number 3 is frustration results from the lack of capacity to change. Capacity can be simply workload or result from a shortage of skills or resource bottlenecks. Because of the cross-functional nature of CSR implementation and the involvement of external suppliers, creating the capacity to change across multiple resources is a particular challenge. Enabler 3.1, securing available resource and creating a shared agenda and priorities. Possible implementation barriers. There is initiative overload, poor planning or anticipation, or resource bottlenecks. Corporate responsibility initiatives are given a low priority or their priority conflicts with others, e.g., cost savings. Individual roles and responsibilities conflict or overlap. Other functions have different priorities, timescales, or constraints. Procurement has limited influence over the actions of others. Enabler 3.2, developing the skills to deliver. Possible implementation barriers. There is a lack of training/subject awareness. It is not clear what new skills/techniques are required or where to get them from. Training budgets/resources are constrained, with limited or no access to external specialists or resources. It is a new subject, so there is limited material, information, or knowledge available. Enabler 3.3, adapting procurement ways of working and developing new approaches. Possible implementation barriers. There is a perception that higher social, economic, or environmental standards may lead to higher costs or potentially threaten existing relationships. Existing strategies do not take account of the impact of procurement actions, the impact of the suppliers and the supply chains they operate within, or the impact of the products and services bought. Resistance to changing practices that conflict or challenge embedded ways of working, for example. Supplier reduction and consolidation may conflict with the desire to broaden the supply base or use smaller suppliers. Financial assessments, which focus on the short-term budget impact rather than whole life picture over the longer term. Balancing the advantages of local sourcing, e.g., local employment opportunities and economic activity, against the price benefits of sourcing globally. Playing safe, avoiding actions because you are working with limited knowledge or an incomplete picture. A lack of engagement because suppliers may not trust procurement's intentions in respect of improving transparency or supply chain performance. Last point is false starts result from a lack of adequate implementation planning. This could be because the subject is difficult to plan or predict, or because the implications and issues that arise once work begins are unexpected and stall the implementation process. Weaknesses across the other enablers also show themselves in an inability to hold a coherent program of actions together. Enabler 4.1, establish clear accountability and resolving conflicts. Possible implementation barriers. The need to involve other stakeholders is not fully recognized. Finding solutions is more complex than originally thought. It is not clear who is responsible for what. There is a lack of experience or expertise. There is no process for resolving issues or conflicts. Enabler 4.2, effective planning. Possible implementation barriers. As an emerging subject, it is difficult to plan and resource. Change initiatives are not project managed. Targets are set in isolation and/or are too ambitious. Other work pressures prevent progress. Progress is not measured or communicated. Now we will cover our point number 2, which is overcoming barriers and resolving conflicts. The task for the PNSM professional is to lead a program of information, education, and awareness to gain the commitment needed to internalize the change. The aim is to reach a point where corporate responsibility is considered to be business as usual. In this section, we outline some of the steps to make this happen. Management structures. To effect complex and diverse change requires close attention, coordination, and leadership from the top. Accountability, roles, and responsibilities should be attributed very clearly so that the strategy and vision at the top level become specific objectives and tasks further down. This involves allocating responsibilities to the existing management structure and in some cases creating new structures to manage implementation. The roles are typically as follows. Main board, vision and strategy, advocacy, high-level priorities, and resources. Corporate implementation team, cross-functional representation, including procurement, development of standards, resources, prioritization, high-level plan and objectives, communication, conflict resolution, obtaining functional commitment. Procurement leadership team, implementation priorities, tools, techniques, training, functional planning, measurement and reporting, obtaining commitment. Buying team/buyers, category/supplier action planning, impact assessment, supplier prioritization, procurement strategies, supplier engagement, implementation, measurement and reporting, obtaining supplier commitment. Suppliers, feedback, implementation planning, implementation, measurement and reporting. Now we will look at point 3, turning strategy into action through the following topics. 1. Strategy. 2. Policy. 3. Planning and prioritization. 4. Communication, tools, training, and development. 5. Supplier relationship management. 6. Sourcing strategy. And 7. Correcting underrepresentation, bias, or adverse market impact. Now we'll review each of them in brief. Let's begin with Number 1. Strategy. At an organizational level, a strategy for corporate responsibility gives the procurement function a legitimate case for incorporating social, economic, and environmental improvement into its own strategies and plans. It also helps to provide a cross-functional framework and better coordination. In the absence of an organization-wide approach, procurement may well be able to make some progress, and it should seek to incorporate improvement objectives into its policies, functional strategies, and sourcing plans. However, there may be limits to what can be achieved, and there is a risk that progress and credibility will be undermined by actions elsewhere in the organization. Number 2. Policy. Policy positions and their associated standards covering the key areas of responsible business detailed in this guide are an essential part of the wider engagement process. This helps to make sure that everyone involved has an opportunity to input and consider the impact on their own functions. This should involve all those who directly and indirectly influence the procurement process, supplier selection, the supply chain, or who have functional ownership of aspects of the policy within the organization, for example HR ownership of social standards. Determining accountabilities is part of policy development and deployment and is essential for success. CIPS can provide access to example policies and frameworks or point to other organizations that can assist. It helps if the standards are based on international agreements such as those created by the International Labour Organization, ILO, 2021, or United Nations, UN Global Compact, 2021, but your organization may wish to go further than these. Some trade organizations, such as those representing the electronics industry, have established Common Supplier Standards, HP, 2021. Unfortunately, there is no single standard that encompasses all of the issues we have covered in this document. Number 3. Planning and prioritization. Most initiatives fail because they are seen as extra work and less important than other business priorities. Partly this results from not understanding the benefits case clearly, but also in not having realistic and practical plans. In terms of corporate responsibility, priorities must be guided by potential risk or impact rather than spend. Very often small changes can make a big difference and make good commercial sense. For example, reducing waste or increasing fuel efficiency will deliver cost savings as well as environmental benefits. Prioritization is also helped by making sure that smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound improvement objectives are developed and agreed at category and buyer level, and ideally also with suppliers. Number 4. Communication, tools, training, and development. Implementation needs to be accompanied by a program of communication, education, and in some cases specialist training. Most of the concepts involved are simple to grasp, but the practical aspects of implementation may require new tools and ways of working. Suppliers are of course part of this process, and full consideration should be given to including suppliers in communication and training programs, and by making tools and techniques available to them as part of the wider effort to improve corporate responsibility in the supply chain. An open dialogue will also encourage best practice sharing and innovation that can be applied more widely. Number 5. Supplier relationship management. Social, economic, and environmental improvement beyond the boundary of the organization is dependent on suppliers and the supply chains they operate within. McKinsey, 2021. The relationship between buyer and seller will significantly affect the conversation, the degree of openness, and the willingness of the supplier to work with the buyer and its own suppliers and supply chain partners. Therefore, the need for improved relationship management practices increases significantly. Social, economic, and environmental exposure is not directly related to spend. Influence through threat or loss of business may be less effective, and the buyer needs to consider more flexible approaches and relationship segmentation practices. Buyers and others involved in managing them should also work hard to communicate consistent messages to establish credibility and trust. Traditional adversarial or arm's-length relationships may not result in improvement. Number 6. Sourcing strategy. Social, economic, and environmental priorities should influence sourcing or category strategies and contract awards. Typically, this will be through the adoption of higher standards for new suppliers while at the same time working with existing suppliers to understand and improve their performance. In most cases, it will be beneficial to work together with the supplier to build capability and awareness rather than to mandate compliance or change suppliers. While this requires more effort and patience, it is more likely to give lasting results. It also demonstrates commitment and will help to build trust and confidence. In some cases, the supplier may present such a high risk to the organization or its reputation that the only option is to move the business to another supplier with better credentials. Care should be taken not to act too quickly and for the social, economic, and environmental consequences of the decision to be considered. The key message is to act responsibly. And number 7. Correcting underrepresentation, bias, or adverse market impact. The procurement process is designed to provide access to and attract the best suppliers capable of meeting the requirements and standards of an organization. However, these processes have often developed in such a way as to create distortions or bias. As a consequence, particular groups or types of suppliers may be underrepresented or excluded from fair consideration. For example, the complexity of tender documentation, contracts, or insurance limits may prevent smaller suppliers from participating. Framework agreements may also exclude capable suppliers for long periods, causing them to leave the market altogether, potentially diminishing competition over the medium to long term. Procurement practitioners have to examine the procurement process and their decisions in order to ensure that social, economic, and environmental requirements and standards are embedded within the sourcing process. The internal and external impact of sourcing decisions and strategies is assessed and taken account of. There is no discrimination against particular groups of suppliers or types of organization. Where groups or types of suppliers are underrepresented, for example women-only enterprises or minority-owned businesses, action can be taken to assist those involved to overcome any barriers. For example, by working with them to increase their capability or by positively discriminating in their favor to correct the distortion or bias. Since the goal is to have a level playing field, this can only be justified on the basis that the buying organization is being disadvantaged by the bias, for example, by excluding capable suppliers, and that such an arrangement is temporary. Now we'll cover the topic 4. Measurement and communication. Under this we will understand the followings. 1. Measuring the contribution of procurement. 2. Balanced scorecard. 3. Whole life costing. 4. Audit and compliance. 5. Resolving conflicts. And 6. Desired end state. We are going to start with measuring the contribution of procurement. Broader considerations need to apply to our assessment of the value that P&SM professionals are delivering. Corporate responsibility challenges us to assess the total impact of what we buy and how we buy it, covering its impact before purchase, during conversion and use, and after use, whole life costing. Against this background, traditional measures of procurement performance such as cost savings are too narrow, and do not reflect broader outputs such as the impact on profit, cash flow, reputation, and increasingly for listed organizations, share price, as well as the external environmental and social impacts of better procurement. Some organizations are beginning to recognize this. For example, Nestle has introduced the concept of creating shared value, Nestle, 2021, including the impact of its supply chains, and share their commitment and progress in the annual Nestle CSV Performance Report, Nestle, 2021. Number 2. Balanced scorecard. Corporate responsibility demands that P&SM professionals work more broadly to deliver value and contribute to the operational success of their organizations. Adoption of a balanced scorecard, Kaplan and Norton, 1996, helps P&SM professionals agree on targets and monitor their performance across their key areas. Kaplan and Norton recommend broadening the scope of measures to include a range of financial, customer, and process measures, as well as those associated with the growth and development of its employees. Performance monitoring across these dimensions is intended not only to provide assurance that the business is on track to meet its goals, but also to position it to meet future demands. An example balanced scorecard for procurement might include contribution to profit and cash flow, risk, supply chain carbon or waste reduction, supply chain social standards, living wages, welfare standards, and education, supply chain diversity and inclusivity, relationship management, customer/consumer satisfaction, management and development of people. Number 3. Whole life costing. Life cycle costing, also called whole life costing, is a technique to establish the total cost of ownership, SIPS, 2021. It is a structured approach that addresses all the elements of this cost and can be used to produce a spend profile of the product or service over its anticipated lifespan. It is an invaluable aid in making more responsible sourcing decisions in that it considers all cost factors, not just the inbound price paid. For example, a Royal Academy of Engineering report found that the typical costs for owning a building were in the ratio of 1 for construction costs versus 5 for its ongoing maintenance during its expected 30-year life, Evans et al., 1998. Number 4. Audit and compliance. As with any initiative designed to improve standards, capability, and compliance need to be checked regularly so that P&SM professionals can be confident that the required standards are being met. Internally, this is normally achieved by adapting existing audit, compliance, and risk management systems for social, economic, and environmental standards. For external suppliers, additional auditing is required. To reduce costs, this can be done by self-assessment, but this typically requires accredited auditors to assess the supplier's operations on the customer's behalf. Some accreditation agencies build a database of supplier findings on behalf of several customers, helping to reduce audit costs. Number 5. Resolving conflicts. Conflicts and uncertainties will arise, particularly during the early stages of implementing a responsible procurement approach. These are much less likely if the ground has been well prepared and policies and standards developed and communicated after cross-functional input. When problems do occur, an organization should have clear structures for resolving them and communicating the issue and rationale to all of those involved. This helps to develop a body of knowledge and shared understanding. For non-competing/non-confidential issues, advice can be also sought from professional or industry bodies. And number 6, desired end state. Corporate responsibility ultimately has to be embedded as part of an organization's normal ways of working and culture, including through policies, systems, and measurement. This often requires special transitional arrangements to build the capability and create the momentum for change before it can become business as usual. The length of this transition depends on the size and complexity of the organization, but can often take 1 or more years to complete. Now we are in an important phase of getting started. An organization-wide corporate responsibility effort is recommended and in the long term will yield the most impact. However, it is still possible for procurement to begin to make sustainable and important changes that will help improve the organization's social, economic, and environmental impact, and may well increase the level of awareness and commitment as well as building the credibility of the procurement function itself. Now we'll cover the topic 5. Getting started. Under this section outlines some of the practical steps that procurement can take to start the change process. 1. The impact of procurement's actions and behavior. 2. The social, economic, and environmental impact of products and services. 3. The impact of the suppliers and supply chains you do business with. The first step is to consider what actions procurement can take to improve its own credentials. This should include adopting a code of ethical behavior across the function and distributing this to all of those who are involved in the sourcing process. The procurement process itself needs to be transparent, consistently adopted, and auditable. This means the guidelines for procurement need to be clear, written down, and understood by all. Procurement can also make sure that its policies or processes do not inadvertently disadvantage smaller suppliers or those representing minority interests or particular sectors. It should ensure that payment terms are adhered to, and stress the importance this has on the organization's reputation as a good corporate citizen. Procurement can also champion easy-to-do business with policies acting as the voice of the supplier, for example, by making contracts simpler and consistent or by dedicating a part of the external website to useful supplier information. There are also steps procurement can take to improve the standard and consistency of relationship management, by segmenting suppliers carefully so that the level of engagement and interaction is appropriate to the nature and complexity of the relationship. Procurement can also examine its sourcing strategies and supplier reduction targets to see if this is discouraging diversity in the wider marketplace or excluding potentially advantageous smaller suppliers. Procurement can also speak as an advocate of responsible business and use a responsible procurement strategy, including minimum requirements they expect to see adopted by external suppliers. This may need internal approval, but many of the standards in terms of the ETI Base Code, ETI, 2021, and Code of Business Ethics, CIPS, 2021, or Environmental Management, ISO 14000, are widely recognized. Such standards can be incorporated as requirements into future tenders for new business. Procurement can also develop assessment methodologies to help identify the areas of expenditure and suppliers that expose the organization to social, economic, or environmental risks, e.g. textile products or raw materials that may involve the use of child labor, or labor subject to the Modern Slavery Act, gov.uk, 2021. Advocating membership of a professional body such as CIPS will also encourage the development of high professional standards. 3. Social, economic, environmental impact of products and services. Buyers need to prioritize their efforts based on the potential risk or impact of the products or services they buy rather than based on expenditure. Often the first opportunity to improve environmental impact is by controlling waste or excessive levels of consumption, which also has an immediate cost benefit. It is also possible to look at areas where recycled materials can be introduced since they generally consume fewer resources, energy and raw materials, than the original product. Biodegradable products and raw materials will also have a lower environmental impact after they have been used. Carbon intensity is very high across the built environment, both in the materials used for construction and in the energy efficiency of buildings during their life. UCC 2021. Design standards and alternative construction methods can lead to a significant reduction in carbon and some to net zero. Where materials are made from natural sources, buyers can make sure that these are sustainable or made from recycled content. Examples include paper, wood products, food, or electricity. Buyers can also look at travel, car fleet, or other energy-intensive areas to make sure that maximum fuel efficiency measures are adopted. Catering services can look to use organic or fair trade product alternatives. Buyers can also work closely with suppliers and marketing or R&D to identify alternative specifications or manufacturing options that have a better social or environmental impact. Often these options will save money as well. And number 4, impact of suppliers and supply chains you do business with. Again, priority should be decided by potential social, economic, or environmental impact rather than expenditure. You should also consider the supply chain beyond the immediate supplier. For example, if the supplier consumes high levels of energy to provide the product or service being bought, this would be an area of opportunity for discussion and potential improvement. Standards, where they are adopted, can also be used to screen new suppliers and to make sure that policies about gifts and hospitality are clear. Procurement and supplier managers can also agree to improvement targets with suppliers as part of their development objectives. Buyers can introduce more rigorous external supplier monitoring so that they are aware of any breach of the law or corporate governance that might indicate deterioration in the supplier's position. Buyers should also make sure that there is a structured process for reviewing contract performance on both sides and make sure that obligations are being met and issues resolved. Championing responsible business is a real opportunity for P&SM professionals to demonstrate their value across a broad spectrum of initiatives and make a difference to their organization, its suppliers, products, and the world around them. Below are some handy hints and tips that will help to maximize the positive impact you can bring. Getting responsible procurement on your organization's strategic agenda will give you a better chance of coordinating the various aspects of standards and policies you will need, and making sure the organization as a whole is giving its support. However, if this doesn't materialize, there are still practical things you can do to make a start. Establish standards cross-functionally by seeking the input of others. Use established standards or emerging frameworks if you can, but don't be afraid to go further if it suits your organization. Remember that procurement and the social, economic, and environmental impact of procurement activity are influenced indirectly by the actions of others who may not be part of procurement. Make sure you connect with them as well. Work with others, including trade and professional bodies, and share information in a non-competitive way if you can. In establishing your priorities, review products/services/suppliers for potential social/economic/environmental impact and the opportunity or risk that they present, as well as the influence you can bring to encourage change. Involve suppliers in the analysis. If there is a potentially excellent supplier who is poor on a particular aspect of corporate responsibility, then work to build capacity rather than switch supplier. This builds trust and credibility. Consider social, economic, and environmental issues early. There is most scope when the business case is being prepared or when defining needs and specifications. Engage the market early and build understanding. Early action will be more successful than trying to add things on at the end. Use performance or outcome specifications where appropriate to drive innovation and find different solutions. Try to give a consistent message to suppliers and stakeholders to create confidence and give practical support and training to those involved. Buyers need to prioritize their efforts based on the potential risk or impact of the products or services they buy rather than based on expenditure. Often the first opportunity to improve environmental impact is by controlling waste or excessive levels of consumption, which also has an immediate cost benefit. It is also possible to look at areas where recycled materials can be introduced since they generally consume fewer resources, energy and raw materials, than the original product. Biodegradable products and raw materials will also have a lower environmental impact after they have been used. Carbon intensity is very high across the built environment, both in the materials used for construction and in the energy efficiency of buildings during their life. UCC 2021. Design standards and alternative construction methods can lead to a significant reduction in carbon and some to net zero. Where materials are made from natural sources, buyers can make sure that these are sustainable or made from recycled content. Examples include paper, wood products, food, or electricity. Buyers can also look at travel, car fleet, or other energy-intensive areas to make sure that maximum fuel efficiency measures are adopted. Catering services can look to use organic or fair trade product alternatives. Buyers can also work closely with suppliers and marketing or R&D to identify alternative specifications or manufacturing options that have a better social or environmental impact. Often these options will save money as well. I hope you enjoyed this video, and before leaving, if you have not already subscribed this channel, make sure to subscribe, like and hit the bell icon to get updates when I post new videos. Provide your feedback in comments. You can download material from the below links under video.